This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard given on the 19th of July, 1954. The title of this lecture is Scientology, Its General Background, Part 3. This lecture is 31 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Arrow Productions.
Continuing on religious and knowledge background of Scientology. When we look at Buddhism, we don't wonder that a great change took place in the operating climate of man, because it certainly did. Rome went under just 800 years later. Now that's fast for the time that it was going, because her whole philosophy shattered. The philosophy of every state operating on force alone, and every barbaric society that Buddhism touched, shattered. The first one to go by the boards was, however, India itself. India at that time was a very, very savage, barbaric area. So was China. Japan is still characterized very, very impolitely by the Chinese. And the civilization of Japan by Buddhism is almost in modern times. The civilization of Japan was completed by America. So there they meet very closely. But now, moving forward on the time track over all of these ages, we discover that it took an awfully long time for the Veda to walk forward and emerge as a new knowledge called the dhyana. And it took quite a little while for the work of Buddha to move out of Asia. But we see the work of Asia itself, not the work of Buddha necessarily, moving out into the Near East. Now, there were trade routes that had existed since time immemorial. Man has no real trace of his own roadways. But the trade routes were quite wide open from very, very early times. We find the Phoenician, for instance, trading very neatly and very nicely up around Great Britain, sailing out through the Pillars of Hercules. We find him, and I was, by the way, last year standing on the edge of a Phoenician ruin, which was advertised as a Roman ruin, but it wasn't a Roman ruin, because it had its inscription in cuneiform, which was a Phoenician script. And this was 1000 BC. 1000 BC. Now, in 1000 BC, a Phoenician ship demonstrated at least 10,000 years of seafaring technology. It was a very complex ship. And Phoenicia spread its empire out through Europe. And just from where and what and why, we have no real trace. But Phoenicia is very well within our own teachings, our own history, and so on. Well, it was 1,000 years after the Phoenicians that we first began in the Western world to actually alert to a higher level of civilization. For some time, the Hebrew in the Middle East had been worshiping in a certain direction along certain lines, and they had as one of their sacred books the book of Job. And many other of their sacred works were immediately derivable from similar sources. And into this society, apparently, other teachings suddenly occurred. Their holy work, known to us as the Old Testament, is leaning very, very heavily on what I just talked to you about, with the exception that it has a rather barbaric flavor, all due respect to the Holy Book. It was a long way from home, a long way from home. And we discover the civilized aspect of that religion, which we know of in the Western world as Christianity, taking place, of course, at the year 1. Now, we find that that's of no importance to us, except that everybody who writes a date out here is talking about the man we're talking about. When he puts down AD, and when he puts down BC, we are dating our very calendar from this incident I am discussing here. The principles known as Buddhism included those, of course, of love thy neighbor, abstain from the use of force. These principles appeared in Asia Minor at the beginning of our own dates. And I'm not, by the way, now discounting even vaguely the work of Christ or Christ himself or anything like that. Traditionally, Christ is supposed to have studied in India. This is traditional. One doesn't hear of him until he's 30 years of age. And he was a carpenter and so on. One hears a lot of things, but he also hears this persistent legend that he had studied in India. Well, this would, of course, be a very, very acceptable fact in view of the fact that the basic philosophy about which he was talking was a philosophy which had been extant in India at this time for about 500 years, a little less than 500 years. So it was about time that it moved out of that area, having taken over by that time 2/3 of the Earth's populace. But we don't quite recognize our Europe if we think of it as a thriving culture. It was not a culture. 1,000 years after Christ, better than that, 1,300 years after Christ, a mighty conqueror stopped on the borders of Europe because he was leaving all areas of civilization, and he saw no slightest gain in attacking an area where everyone was cloaked in fur loincloths. That was Tamerlane, Timuri Lang. Now, when we look at the Middle Eastern picture, we find ourselves looking at the rise of a philosophy which, however interpreted, however since utilized, is nevertheless a very, very interesting philosophy. You have told your pre-clears, I am sure, to stop running those flows and to get some space, and so he could tolerate that, and then change his considerations. Do you suppose for a moment that a pre-clear can actually get anywhere if he continues to use force? Or whether we try to put this into a public practice such as turn the other cheek, or whether we use it for theta clearing, the emancipation of a soul, we certainly are looking at the same fact. We're looking at the words of Gautama Buddha, however we wish to interpret this. Now, the parables which are discovered today in the New Testament are earlier discovered, the same parables, elsewhere in many places, one of them the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which predates the New Testament considerably. Now, we are talking about love thy neighbor. We're talking about be civilized. We're talking about use no force. But at the same time, we are talking straight out of the mouth of Moses. So we evidently are at a crossroads of two philosophies. But these two philosophies are both the philosophies of wisdom. Now, the Hebrew definition of Messiah is one who brings wisdom, a teacher, in other words. Messiah is from messenger. But he is somebody with information. And Moses was such a one. And then Christ became such a one. He was a bringer of information. He never announced his sources. He spoke of them as coming from God. But they might just as well have come from the God talked about in the hymn to the Dawn Child, who, by the way, is rather hard to distinguish from gods talked about later on. He's certainly not the Hebrew God, the God the Christians worshipped. He looks more like that one talked about in the Veda. He looks much more like it. And we come on down from there, and we find that we are talking about a meeting place, a sort of a melting pot of religious practices stemming from various wisdoms. But the highest amongst those wisdoms is apparently the Veda and the teachings of Gautama Buddha. The parables coming from the Egyptian Book of the Dead and from various other places were probably not original with the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So it is not true that the parables of Christ necessarily came from Egypt, since we know full well that Moses escaped from Egypt and that the Jewish peoples stem their history from their freedom from bondage in Egypt. Not all of their history, but the history which they speak of mostly in the New Testament. Now here we have a great teacher in Moses. We have other messiahs, and we then arrive with Christ. And the words of Christ were a lesson in compassion, and they set a very fine example to the Western world compared to what the Western world was doing at that moment. What were they doing at that time? They were killing men for amusement. They were feeding men to wild beasts for amusement. In the middle reign of Claudius, we find 3,500 men being turned loose, 4 abreast, divided half and half across a bridge of boats, slaughtering each other for the amusement of the patricians. How long can a society stand up when it is worshiping force to this degree? Now, however these teachings were interpreted, the vein of truth was still here, that an exclusive reliance upon force will bring about a decay and a decadence which is unimaginably terrible. And that was the truth which came through. And we find the Buddhist principles of brotherly love and compassion then appearing 2,000 years ago. Now, Christianity spread like wildfire throughout Europe, but it was necessary to achieve a certain agreement. And in order to achieve that agreement, many of the practices which you know of today were incorporated into this worship. Basic and early Christianity is not recognizable today in many church practices. It's just not recognizable. I mean, it is very clouded. But these churches themselves recognize as their original source the New Testament. And the New Testament contains, aside from a few court records and a few legends, all that we know of this particular transition. But here we have this information, poorly interpreted, badly carried through areas which did not know how to read and write, which is quite different from Asia. And we found this church and that church having to pick up and adopt customs in order to gain any entrance into these new areas. We discover today the worship of the winter solstice in our Christmas. That is German and that is also other barbaric societies. Almost every barbarism that's ever existed has worshipped the departure and return of the sun in the northern hemisphere. And we find this incorporated into Christianity, and over there we find that incorporated into Christianity, and over somewhere else we find this one. Each time a certain amount of superstition coming into the information line, until we don't know what was on the information line unless we go back to sources and trace it through clearly and purely. We are again, however, working with wisdom. What wisdom? The wisdom of knowing how to know oneself to resolve the mystery of life. And when this Christianity was interpreted and imported into Europe, there was considerable speculation and resurgence and an enormous amount of hope. The very same thing that the Buddhists hoped for became the hope, and this is what is very interesting, became the hope of the Christian world. Emancipation from the body, the survival and immortality of the human soul. And although there was a cult in Rome which had this idea, it itself had no great antiquity. And it had evidently stemmed over from Persia, which was closer yet. Now, the Christian impact wiped out this other cult, but that's because they were just alike. And one couldn't distinguish one from the other, and the Christians won. Now, we have this immortality, this hope of salvation being expressed throughout Europe. And they found it expedient to keep extending it, because they keep promising people that it was just about to occur. The day of judgment was just about to occur. Now, get this as a sort of a barbaric interpretation of what Gautama Buddha was talking about. The emancipation of the soul from the cycle of births and deaths. Now, he was talking about that, you see. And now we get the fact that there's going to be a day when somebody blows a horn, and it's all going to occur. We don't know what barbarism that superstition came from, but we have that superstition today in our society. The day of judgment, at first, hell was only the fact that Rome was going to disappear in a sea of lava, and everyone wanted to see Rome die. And that recruited people left and right. They promised them that Rome was going to disappear in a sea of molten lava. And they tried to prove it in Nero's reign by burning the place down. Well, they didn't have a great deal of success doing it. Rome went on surviving, was finally taken over entirely, and has since been the orientation point of Christianity. 1,000 years or so after Christ, they started to try to take back the actual birthplace of Christ in Jerusalem, and there's been considerable argument going on about it back and forth ever since. But the orientation point was made the only stable point, because that was the part of the world to which all roads led. And that became the dissemination point of all this information. But Rome split off and went back to Constantinople. And we had then the Constantinople branch of this church. And it, however, received its biggest blow when Russia suddenly turned completely atheist. We don't hear too much of that church anymore. Well, we still hear a great deal in the Western world of this church at Rome. It is still there. Now, the use of Christianity was to produce a certain civilized state. And many people would blackguard Christianity by saying it reduced people down to a very low level indeed. This is not true. It took an entire world of slaves and it made freemen out of them. This in itself was quite a gain. It took a world which worshipped exclusively force and matter and made it recognize that sooner or later one would have to turn to the fact that he had a soul. Now, remember that Christianity, in its basic wisdoms and so forth, is still available to us in the New Testament, and that this is really, no matter how it has come through the line, is quickly and swiftly traceable back to the Veda. We have a consistent track, in other words, here. This track is very consistent. The same messages coming through. The Christian God is much better characterized in the Vedic hymns than in any subsequent publication, including the Old Testament. The Old Testament doesn't make near as good a statement of what the Christians think of as God as the Veda. All right, not to go over this forever, we have the loss of the trade routes somewhere in the vicinity of about 1000 A.D., and land travel ceased. Land travel up to that time had been very, very good between Europe and Asia. You had Europe wearing silks and using Asian products back and forth. There was a good route through there, but remember that this was very far from a barbarism they were crossing there in the Middle East. This included Chaldea, what was left of Chaldea, what was left of Babylon, which of course were Persia at that time. It included tremendous numbers of civilizations, and these trade routes went right straight through one to the other. It wasn't run as a straight route, it was run as a relay route. You see, the caravans would go just so far, and then they'd relay their packs, and they'd go just so far, and they'd relay, and they did all this not on any plan, but on a barter system. So you could get goods all the way through. Well, those routes were closed, and they weren't opened up again. No trade with Asia was opened up until Vasco da Gama. Now, there was an enormous period of non-communication. A long period of non-communication there. What had happened is Genghis Khan, the various hordes which had been trying to pour out of Russia, had cut them time and time again, and the amount of unrest and so forth, the taking of Baghdad and Jerusalem by such people, of course, just kept these things cut. You couldn't travel safely between these two worlds. And we find that communication doesn't open up again there until sometime really in the 17th century. Oh, it opened up a little bit earlier, but not really open. And we find in the middle of the 17th century, we find certain Eastern practices beginning to show up in France. And about the middle of the 17th century, there are many books being published, all about you could do this and you could do that and you'd achieve something else. As a matter of fact, the doctrine of the chakra is an interesting one because that talks about theta clearing. It talks all backwards and upside down and so on. You had to clear yourself of 7 entities, of which the thetan was the last one, and so forth. But we find this being published in France in the middle of the 17th century, having come through on these reopened sea routes to Asia. Now, quite incidentally, during this period, a navigator who should have taken more lessons, but fortunately didn't, by the name of Christopher Columbus, discovered America. He was simply trying to get to Asia, because everybody knew everybody in Asia knew everything and had everything, and so you had to get to Asia. And he ran into America, fortunately, because he'd miscomputed the size of the Earth so grossly that he would have perished out in the endless oceans if there hadn't been a continent there to receive him. I speak, that is the opinion of the Explorers Club, almost en masse, concerning Columbus. A bunch of experts on exploration looked at that man's exploration and shook their heads, but he was a very wise man. He discovered variation of the compass and various other things, but he failed. It was up to the Portuguese to continue around the bottom of the Cape of Good Hope and open the lanes to Europe. And as soon as we get them open, we first find all of this information flooding in. Information suddenly starting to appear, parts of the Veda starting to appear, various practices of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, other things start to crop up in Europe. And right along with this, we begin to get such things as the Arabian Nights. And in the middle of the 18th century, we get, you might call, a renaissance of literature, the birth of the novel, and so forth, coincident with the introduction of the Arabian Nights into France. A fascinating flood of information that came in about that time. And the culture had already, during the Renaissance, picked up considerably, but the Renaissance was right in there with Marco Polo. And we find some other interesting routes were open during that time. People had managed to get through. Well, I'm not trying to tell you that everything was invented by Asia, but Asia had a tradition of information. They had kept their records, which was not true of the Western world. They'd kept their records, and so the information was there, and you might say it was a depository of knowledge which might as well have originated in the Western world, gone to Asia, been put on file, and come back again. I don't care how you would trace this one way or the other, but we still find that it was the repository of all the wisdom there was in the world at that time. And it has more or less continued so. Now, the philosophers, the early Greeks, and so forth, on forward, made the first division in wisdom. And they said, there is wisdom about the soul, and there is wisdom about the physical universe. And there's some speculation about life. And this is the tradition of the Greek philosopher, and that has come forward to us as represented by people like Kant, represented to us by people like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, so forth. Interesting material. And oddly enough, those writings are coincident with new releases of Asian information in Europe. Had you ever accused Schopenhauer of writing nothing but sacred lore, he probably would have committed suicide. But he never wrote anything else. Now, where did we get this artificial breakdown? We got it right there in the Middle East. The Greek came forward, went through Rome, and the philosophic, scholarly, consecutive line has come to us through barbarisms. What we call science today came to us from a barbarism, Greece, which civilized itself. It's an independent shoot of information. Now, the Western world is specialized in this, and it has never made enough advance in the humanities with it to bother about. So that today it would gladly, just to fill another test tube full of guck, it would very, very happily blow all of man off the face of the earth. It is completely divorced from the humanities. Where we come to the humanities, and where we have to do anything for the humanities or with the humanities, we go straight back, all the way back, as far as we can go, to the Veda, and come on forward. And as long as we're on that track, we're on a track which means better men. And when we go on the other track, we're talking about dead men. We're talking about dead men in an arena. We're talking about dead men on battlefields. We're talking about dead men in cities under atomic bombs. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about barbarisms, and that is the tradition of barbarism. The only thing that has let the Western world survive all along this track was an entirely different track, that which went back to sacred lore 10,000 years. Scientology, then, today, could not possibly be characterized as a science, the way the Western world understands science. Scientology carries forward a tradition of wisdom which concerns itself about the soul and the solution of mysteries of life, and that is what it concerns itself with. It has really not deviated. The only reason why I would suddenly come up and do something like this in the Western culture, a very simple reason. I studied my earliest years, the first thing I was exposed to in this life was a rough, tough frontier society. Montana. And there was nothing tougher than Montana, either in terms of weather or in terms of people. And from there, I went over to the completely soft Far East and heaved a long sigh of relief and found out what it meant to be in part of a civilization. And the shock was so great to me that I was very deeply impressed. And so, although I was a young American, I did pay attention. I had many, many friends in the western hills of China, friends elsewhere, friends in India, and I was willing to listen. I was also willing to be very suspicious, and I was willing to be very distrustful. But I was never willing to completely turn aside from the fact that there was some possible solution to the riddle of where man came from. Now, any work that I am doing or have done and that you are doing has a tremendously long and interesting background. You are delving with and working with the oldest civilized factors known to man. Anything else is Johnny-come-lately. As far as Scientology being a religion is concerned, it has more right to be a religion than the Catholic Church has, and could stand up and be proven in court to that effect. Anybody who would dare try to make religion into solely a religious practice would be neglecting the very background of Christianity. Wisdom has no great tradition in the Western world. But if we are very industrious, it will be up to us to make one. Thank you.
This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard given on the 20th of July, 1954. The title of this lecture is Bridge Between Scientology and Civilization. This lecture is 33 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Era Productions.
Continuing now the information and discussion of the long background of Scientology. You might wonder how it came about that Scientology arose in a period of a few years. Actually, a quarter of a century is the apparent amount of study on it as a subject. It might seem to you to be completely incredible that this much information would suddenly arise completely independent of source, other source. And yet, any man would be capable of doing such a thing if he simply concentrated on it and if he looked instead of figuring about the whole thing. But Scientology didn't arise spontaneously. It was very well backed up by an enormous amount of information. When I was quite young, I had the opportunity of looking over Eastern cultures and barbaric cultures, and I had a great many friends who were very, very interested in the field of the soul, the mind, friends of all colors, shapes, sizes, creeds, and professions. The main thing which came home to me when I was very young in Asia and various places was that although these people apparently knew something, I could not conceive that they were using it. Here was the Western idea of rendering a punch and getting in there and getting something done and must arrive and so forth, up against the timelessness of the East. How one man could simply sit still and think or not think for a half a century, and I have seen some men who have done this in the East, was incomprehensible to me. The thing to do was to act. That was my philosophy. As much material as might have leaked into my ears, we had considerable of it utterly rejected. If these people were so bright, if these people were so intelligent, why didn't they have better sewer systems? The philosophy of a progressive land grown up on the philosophy that if you could hit hard enough, suddenly enough, you ate. Up against the philosophy of a land where if you sat long enough and could endure enough, sooner or later something would walk by and maybe you could eat. And that was all right. Now, as we look over these two philosophies, we see that a young American indoctrinated into speed, action, dash, certainly couldn't put up very much with meditation. So it looked to me when I was very young that they were taking the long way at it, if they were going at anything at all. I was not too sure of this. And even today, I'm not too sure of this, because I have seen people get into the figure category and be utterly incapable of progressing beyond that point. They simply start chewing up data, and then they maul it around, and they think it around, and they figure, and they figure, and they figure. Yet at the same time, in Asia, I saw a great many, and have seen a great many things which you would call miracles. And I could not put these things from my mind. I have seen such things as 8 matches floating in a bowl of water being made to drill by an individual who simply looked at them. He actually looked at these 8 matches floating in a bowl and would rack them up just by looking at them, so that they made an orderly line, one line, and then make them all turn sideways so that they looked like a picket fence, and then make them form something that looked like a star. Intriguing, to say the least. A parlor trick, fakirism, yet it was very impressive. I have seen the Indian rope trick done complete, and as a matter of fact, can do it. It's a very simple matter. It merely depends upon your ability to utterly hypnotize your audience. I have not hypnotized an audience for many years, the last one being the staff of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And that's factually true. I did. I hypnotized the whole staff. Mostly because they didn't know what I was talking about, and I wanted them on my side, so I simply told them that Dianetics was a very fine thing and that they should go and sin no more. But here in the East, we find a tradition of wisdom. And it was that thing more than anything else which came through to me when I was quite young. A tradition of wisdom, the freedom to think. The freedom to be an individual, to be as eccentric as one pleases, and to lie down and die if it struck one as that was the thing to do. In Coal Hill, just outside Pekin, I have seen a coolie sitting on the edge of an open hole, just sitting there and waiting for the groundskeeper to push him in when he was dead. He goes up, he gives the groundskeeper 3 coppers, he sits down on the edge of a hole, and he wills himself to die, and the groundskeeper will, of course, push him into the hole and push the hole in after him after this has occurred. What a strange world, a world incomprehensible to a young American that somebody would simply get tired of life and decide to die. I have seen men lying on the street, starving to death. I've seen them receive a broken leg in an accident and simply sit there, just sit there, and no passerby felt even vaguely called upon to do a thing about it. A weird and peculiar country to my frame of reference. You should help people, you should do this, and you should do that. But freedom to think, freedom to be, and freedom to become anything was predominant. It wasn't complete carelessness, as I first supposed. It was a tradition of intellectual freedom. Now, I was quite accustomed to thinking in terms of rituals and Zen Buddhism and talking about the possibilities of this or that and hereafters and nirvanas and so on. This was all quite common and ordinary to me, and I came back to America. This was a great shock. It's probably something I never should have done. I probably should have stayed abroad. As a matter of fact, until I was 30, I used to think about it periodically and curse myself in every language I could curse in. I know a lot of curses in a lot of languages. And it seemed to me the most idiotic thing I had ever done was return to the Western world, mostly because there was no intellectual freedom. I ran into this head-on. I never went to high school, took the New York Regents and entered directly into engineering school. And when I arrived, why I was taking engineering is another story. But when I arrived in the engineering school, I was stunned to discover that no one cared whether I thought or not. And it was inconceivable to me that an education could be carried forward anywhere by simply the relay of data. If one never invited anybody to think and never permitted any allowance for thought, how possibly could one ever become educated? I had an entirely different definition for education than those who were doing educating. And I wrote a theme on this subject. I had heard that there was the longest sentence in the English language was 289 words, so I wrote a 500-word sentence which merely said this. And when you go on that long with only one and one but and no semicolons, it begins to build up a considerable velocity. And I said that a man was not permitted to think in the Western world, and that this would inhibit any culture arising from universities. And having said that, I was called up by the dean, if you please, the dean of English of that university. Out of the engineering department, one should be so honored. And he told me that unless I would write an entirely different theme, expressing entirely different sentiments, I would be expelled from the university. That was very strong. And I wrote him another sentence. It did not controvert what I had said before, but it was written in irony, and so no one received the message that was in it. Well, I didn't really realize even then that there was a constriction on intellectual freedom in the West until years later, when I'd become a writer. This same dean, now retired, saw my name on the newsstands and the bookstores, and he finally looked up my address, and he wrote me a letter and told me that there was a little thing which he had meant to tell me for many, many years. He still had my theme. And he said at the time, in his position, it would have been impossible for him to have done anything else, but he considered it an excellent piece of thinking and of literature, and he had preserved it. Dean William Allen Wilbur. Good heavens, how could a man who was virtually in charge of a university actually bow to this sort of regimentation? I couldn't conceive of it. And that kindled a spark of revolt in me. It was a very bad thing to happen to a young man who was at best receiving back his own country with considerable questions. You got up in the morning, there was no boy there to hand you polished shoes. When you went outside and said good morning to somebody, he didn't answer politely, good morning, how are you, or anything like that. He said, what's good about it? I had been known uniformly as Mr. Hubbard, very politely, and now I was known as Red or Hubbard. Fascinating world I was living in. And so, in the engineering laboratory, I conceived that there might be something of interest in the field of the human mind. Now, part of this had been kindled off by a good friend of mine, Commander Thompson of the Navy, who was one of the personal students of Sigmund Freud. And he had taught me something about psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was received by me as just another method of thinking about things, but with it came this message, that a man was free to think about thinking. In the engineering laboratories, I wanted to find the smallest particle of energy. And that was a great deal of interest to me, because I had heard of mind essence of the Buddhists. I had heard of many things. I'd been taught in various schools that as far as energy was concerned, it wasn't. And I wanted to find if there was a bridge piece of energy, a tiny particle, which would span this difference between observable energy and not observable energy. And I started to look for it, and of course the place to look would be in the human mind, wouldn't it? So I conducted a series of experiments and discovered immediately that no one can remember more than 3 months' worth, if thought is memory, if these energy particles of thought are infinitely small. The amount of memory storage in the mind is negligible if you consider the mind the brain. The protein molecules, there are, I think, 10 to the 21st power binary digits of neurons in the body, something on that order. Anyway, it's a large number. And if each one of these had a great many, punched holes in them, and if you stored in each one of these punched holes 1,000 memories, you would still not have enough actual perception to recall back over a period of 3 months. I proved this conclusively, and mathematically I wrote a paper on it and turned it in to Dr. White, who was in charge at that time of St. Elizabeth's and who was a very good friend of mine. And that paper I heard from next as emanating from Austria in 1937, proving conclusively that we think with protein molecules. Something had happened to the paper in the meantime, but as far as I was concerned, we had actually proven, as far as I was concerned, that we had to look elsewhere for the answer to the mind. Something was wrong with the mind. Well, that somethingness was evidently energy. There was something about energy. People were using energy, but people didn't have to use energy. And I went on and got the all-time championship low grades for that university in nuclear physics. The only reason they ever let me go on from class to class, since I never was really in the classes to amount to anything, was the fact that the assistant dean of the engineering school was a good friend of mine. I taught him how to fly. And he knew that I was never going to practice engineering and so would never disgrace the school, and that was what he'd tell me. The mathematics department and I were always at each other's throats, and I spent most of my time in the university fooling around. I'd go over to the psychology department or I'd go someplace else and do something. And of course, at that time, I was supporting myself with my writing. And the only thing I actually knew how to do in order to stack up a great many dollars in bank accounts in the Western society was simply you wrote something and you sent it to a book publisher or a magazine and you received back a check. And this seemed to me to be a rather gentlemanly activity. And in view of the fact that I only had to work at it about 3 days a week, 3 hours a day, to produce 100,000 words a month, I was not exactly, you might say, overburdened and overlabored with this. You have to write pretty fast in order to do that, but in the main, you have to write certainly, with great certainty, since you never have time to copy it. It isn't that you don't like to duplicate, it's just that it's not efficient. You write it, you never read it, you send it off. You never hear of it again, except somebody comes up to you 2 or 3 years later when it's being published and circulated and says, that's fine. The only thing I ever wrote seriously you have never heard of. It was written in magazines, which are very expensive magazines that are supposed to be circulated amongst the intellectual houses of the country and so forth, and which pay you absolutely nothing. Nevertheless, I did write serious articles on various subjects through that period, and at the end of, at the end of 1941, which closed a phase in my life, I believe I had received at that time over $800 from intellectual magazines over a period of about 7 years of hard professional work, and I had received very, very close to 200,000 for fiction. There's something unreal about the Western world. Just giving you enough background on this so you won't have any strange idea about the development of Scientology. Along about 1938, I had studied quite a bit, and I had thought quite a bit about the mind. I made myself enough cash so that I could sit back for a short time and be very intensive on this subject. And I carried forward a series of biological experiments and discovered, oddly enough, that a cell can be taught on down its generations. Very crude biology. I'm a very, very poor laboratory man. But I found out that you could teach cell A something, such as a puff of cigarette smoke contains nicotine and is deadly and will make you sick. And several generations later, we have educated the cellular line to flee from steam, which contains no nicotine. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Cellular memory. The cells could remember. This was enough for me. I started to add it up, and I said, what is the common denominator of existence? And came up at that time with the dynamic principle of existence as survive. Well, however else it went together and whatever else I did about it, I wrote a book at that time, a book called Excalibur, which you have never read. Mostly because it is simply a dissertation of what might be, rather than a series of, it's a series of speculations more than anything else. And just recently, we were scooping up some of the tag ends of speculations in that Excalibur. In other words, I drew the high water mark of processing, therapy, speculation, philosophy, drew it very, very high in the form of speculation, and then had absolutely no bridge to go between that and what was factually true in the society. What was observably true and what was speculatively true. There was no bridge between. It took a number of years to get a bridge in between those two facts. This work was interrupted in 1941. During the 30s, I'd been on several expeditions, and I had learned from various barbaric cultures that man basically does not think in any other way than man thinks. Just because he is thinking about one subject or another subject is no reason he is thinking differently. He will come to the same conclusion whether he is doing his work by nuclear physics, mathematics, or doing his work by mumbo-jumbo. What he does is get an answer, and then he justifies it with some symbolic track. I was quite convinced of this, and that man was drawing a sort of an artificial bridge between his conclusions and his basic problems. He was evidently getting there by intuition and loudly promising everybody that he was getting there by logic. A very curious thing, and I looked at this with some amusement. And the war came along, and I considered the war a great injustice for an excellent reason, that in 1936 in Forbes magazine and in other places I had said we were going to go to war with Japan because Japan was the kind of a nation which would commit suicide. That was their national trait. And if we stopped them too hard in their incursion across Asia, having already sent them upon that conquest in the days of Theodore Roosevelt, we started their conquest of Asia. And then if we had stopped them, I knew that they would commit suicide. And in 1941, I found myself in Washington, so I sort of went into apathy about the whole thing and joined the armed services. The war hadn't begun yet, and I was commissioned on June the 25th in Washington, D.C. As a lieutenant junior grade. Now, the only reason I took a commission at that time is everybody said we wouldn't possibly be called into service because I was engaged in rewriting some of the Hydrographic Office publications about the various coasts of America at that time. You don't take a man like that and send him out suddenly as an officer in some capacity or another. Well, I wouldn't have worried about it one way or the other. December the 7th came around, and there was a big war on every hand, and what do you know? They grabbed me and threw me into uniform in less time than you could snap your fingers, and I went to Asia. Well, that is, they sent me in that direction. Well, in 1945, April the 11th, I think to be exact, when I was entered into the hospital at Oak Knoll Hospital in Oakland, I conceived that I was going to have a lot of leisure time on my hands in the study of subjects in which I was quite interested. They had many endocrine projects running at that time, so during the ensuing many months, up to February the 16th, 1946, while I was still in the service, I was at that hospital, and I utilized all my spare time to study the endocrine system of the body. By taking off one collar tab, I had adequate entrance to a very large hospital's library where no doctor knew any other doctor anyway. I ruined some of their experiments simply by giving a good, solid psychoanalytic treatment to some of the people they had under test to find out whether or not testosterone would improve the eating and protein assimilation capacity of ex-prisoners of war taken out of Japanese camps. I would get a hold of the boy and knock out some of the blocks that kept him from assimilating the male hormone. You know, I'd get him over an allergy to sex mentally, and he would take an enormous rise in his ability to absorb the drug. And at that time, these tests, which we won't go into particularly, demonstrated to me conclusively that structure did not monitor function, that function monitored structure. And I proved this over and over and over to my own satisfaction. Mind over matter, not matter over mind. The only reason I would have been confused about this in the first place is because this Western world had been confused about it since the days of the early Greeks. Been very, very confused about it. So much so that today, if you ask a doctor how he's going to treat somebody or get somebody well, he will tell you what he is going to do. He's going to operate or he's going to administer a pill, whereas the answer to the situation lies in the mind. Well, after that period in the hospital, I came out. I was badly disabled by the war, and by 1948, I was back on my feet and hitting on at least all one cylinder. And I got into the swing of things, returned to writing, and published Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health, which was expected to sell 6,000 copies. And and was being very limited in its printing by its publisher. And 500,000 Americans read it. And after that, I didn't have to write to support my researches. I went on researching, and of course, the whole research picture catalyzed very rapidly. In the ensuing 5 years leading up to now, a great deal of material has been accumulated, and the amount of knowledge which we have at this time is actually tremendous. I think offhand that there's probably more knowledge been accumulated in the last few years concerning the human mind than there's been accumulated in the last 10,000. That's not a brag. It's merely because one used everything that was known in those 10,000 years, and he used everything that he could see, and he used a world which had come up to the idea that we must be factual, not speculative, and we must prove everything we do, and we must observe everything and make sure it's true, and above all, we must get an effect. We must hit that blow. We must arrive. And having imbibed that lesson very, very well, I was very determined that we would bring this investigation up to a level where it was intensely workable, not by some savant, some soothsayer, some mummified relic sitting on top of a mountain getting cold in the snow, but by anybody who cared to use it, and that seemed to me to be an admirable goal. This was the identical goal which was launched by the Vedic peoples, the identical goal of Gautama Buddha, and is something toward which people have been studying and hoping, mostly hoping these last few centuries, in the field of Asia, in the entire field of Buddhism. They have prophecies and so forth about someone who might come into the Western world, and it's a very descriptive philosophy and prophecy and so forth about the whole thing, and make it possible to free one from the cycle of births and deaths in one lifetime. Well, they could, of course, prophesy this with the greatest of ease, because it was inevitable as knowledge accumulated, that sooner or later somebody would have enough leisure time to look over the problem thoroughly from one end to the other and take all of the recognizable truths that were already there and add to them to a point where this could be accomplished. This was inevitable that this would occur. If it hadn't occurred in this century, it would have occurred a few centuries hence. There's only one slight thing that would have disturbed its occurrence, and that is the atomic bomb. But I dare say the atomic bomb will not find it possible to destroy all life on Earth and man. I know, because man has been busy one time or another trying to destroy me. I mean, not on a basis of where I wasn't shooting back, I was. But I found myself very unkillable, and I found an awful lot of people around in the war awfully unkillable. And it just seems to me like man is a survivor type, and sooner or later he would have gotten through this one too, and he would have come up with these answers somewhere along the track. Maybe not for another 1,000,000 years, maybe not for another 10 years, but sooner or later this answer would have been produced, merely because it is the answer for which man has been looking for 10,000 years. Naturally then, one exposed to the science of the Western world and the religious mysticism and the factualness of the Eastern world, mixing them together, would have recognized that there was a worthwhile goal to go toward, and having recognized it as a goal, certainly would have arrived had he started upon it. The main thing that we have uncovered today is the state of beingness which one actually has. Instead of speculations about does man have a soul or doesn't man, we have data. We know exactly what a thing is. We know tremendous numbers of things with great accuracy. And furthermore, we also know that there aren't any more mysteries in terms of phenomena to know in the human mind or body. It's a very, very odd thing, but we have shaken most of them out. On an examination of the whole track, we've found practically every gadget life has been fond of using. And we find out that man can be free, and he is best off when he is free. And if we want to recover those periods of euphoria which individuals sometimes get, we would simply free an individual very, very thoroughly a man can be free in one lifetime now, as far as he is concerned as a soul. Now, that is interesting. We are trying to make it apply to every person we process. That's a great difficulty, but we can do that too. We could apply it with great ease to over half of the people we process. And remember, they only made a few Bodies 2,500 years ago, a very, very few. We have made more theta clears per month than there were arhats made in all of the history of Buddhism. We're getting there. All right. The entire field of knowledge, then, doesn't necessarily narrow down to this work, but it has made it possible for this work to be produced. I want you to understand that very clearly, that no necromancy has taken place. Life has been working it for an awful long time, been working at it hard, and it's time at least somebody won, at least partially, on this particular goal line. And I think we have done so. Thank you.